Okay, welcome. We're so excited to talk about this topic, thriving in your high school journey to UT Austin. Um, you are so lucky this evening to have Lisa and Delora talk with you about this journey. Lisa is the founder of College Matchpoint and is the senior college coach at ESM Prep College Matchpoint. Delora is a college coach at College Matchpoint as well, and also the author of our ever popular Guide to Applying to UT Austin. I'm Bob Carlton. A couple of housekeeping notes. We will be sharing in the follow-up email to this the recording of the webinar, the actual presentation materials themselves, and our guide to applying to UT Austin. We do have a Q&A box, so as we go, please feel free to share questions. Some of them may be so specific to a student that we can't answer. Some may be so global that we fold them into the discussion itself. Um, College Matchpoint, ESM College Matchpoint, has been working with students applying to UT Austin for 2 decades. Lisa, do you think the first student we worked with had UT on her list, or was it the second or the third?
I think it was the second. The first student did not.
Yeah, so UT on an annual basis, two-thirds of the students that we work with apply to UT. The majority of them aren't auto admit, and most often they're applying to competitive majors. We are overjoyed when we see students, we run into them, we talk to them, and they talk about how they're thriving on the 40 acres. And as a result of those hundreds of students that we've worked with at UT, we have a really good sense. I always joke we don't have a Ouija board of predicting whether or not you'll get into UT, but we have a really good feel for how UT reads and evaluates students. We want to start by giving you a context for what happened in the most recent season. So, obviously, this doesn't apply to the seniors who are applying to UT Austin. This applies to the freshmen who started at UT Austin this fall. UT, very popular school in the United States prior to the pandemic, had been averaging anywhere between 48 and 52,000 applications. You can put UT Austin in that category of schools whose applications skyrocketed during the pandemic. Well, it really is a school that has seen increasing popularity nationally. And with the growth of high school families here in the state of Texas, an explosion in the number of kids who put the school on their list. In a recent survey, UT Austin was listed as the eighth most popular school in the United States. What this growth looks like is truly application inflation. There aren't any more dorms or classrooms, at least on campus dorms, that have been built at UT Austin. So it's the same set of seats that kids are competing for. Now, in the most recent class, the auto admit threshold was the top 6%. Three-quarters of the incoming class at UT Austin comes from the auto admit class. Those are standards and guidelines passed down by the state legislature. One of the things that I think is always for families an important level set to have is that auto admit guarantees a student seat in the College of Liberal Arts. They are still competing at competitive majors like business or computer science or engineering. And we have seen valedictorians, we have seen students with straight high A's end up with a seat in the College of Liberal Arts. And that's spectacular, but it was not the first or second choice major they applied to. As I mentioned before, the largest percentage of students that we work with are not auto admit students. Last year, the blended admit rate for students who were not auto admit was 11%. And by blended, I mean for a major like computer science, You can assume it was actually as competitive to get into computer science at UT, not auto admit, as it is to get into Stanford. Okay. On the other hand, you can see some majors like philosophy that have a much higher admit rate than 11% for non auto admit students. It really is a blended percentage based on the first choice major that the student declared. And we want to tell you from personal experience with students who we've been lucky enough to work with that there are countless kids who were not auto admit and they got into competitive majors. And if you walk away with anything from this webinar, I hope you walk away with a sense of what do those students look like? What's the profile of those students? And how does that fit the rubric that UT Austin has established? Now, many families enter into the UT process if they're aware of UT, knowing that there is a secondary option called CAP. And CAP is a program for Texas residents that says you applied to UT Austin, you met an academic threshold, but you were not offered admissions to UT Austin. And so as a result, we'll offer you admissions to either UT San Antonio or UT Arlington. We'll ask if you pass some thresholds academically that you apply for transfer to UT Austin and you'll have a place at UT Austin. Two things. One, many students sort of self cap by applying to UT Dallas. And by what I mean by that is it's a much less competitive school, but it is a sensational school. And then CAP is a great option, but it is very difficult to transition from either one of those schools to a competitive major. Now, what are the impacts of that application inflation? The competitive majors got even more competitive. Computer science, engineering, business, nursing, natural sciences became increasingly competitive. And as a result, in the changes that UT Austin announced over the last 9 months, they doubled down on their approach, which they call fit to major. The first way they doubled down is requiring test scores. So students who are applying are asked to submit test scores. And when UT made the announcement going back to a test score requirement, they stressed in the announcement that they won't be just looking at the overall test score. They'll be looking at the component test score as it relates to the student's first choice major. An engineering applicant's math score is disproportionately important as an indication of academic strength in their read of fit to major. The auto admit threshold changed. It went down, sadly, from 6% to 5%. And then UT announced a series of changes, adding an early action deadline of October 15th. The effect of that is commits to students they'll hear earlier than if they applied regular decision, a waitlist option, and a clear articulation of something that we had seen for the last several years, and that is that they prefer, or at least are open to non-school letter of recs. Okay. So the landscape for UT with the application inflation of the last several years has been an increasing level of competition. And the changes announced over the last several months reset the board in terms of how UT is going to evaluate the applicants they receive. Now, Lisa, we've talked about fit to major. Could you unpack a little bit about what the UT approach to fit to major looks like in terms of holistic review?
Absolutely. So, first, let me define what holistic review is. Many of us think of a school as big as UT, and we would think that, oh, they're just going to look at the test scores, look at the grades, and make a decision. That could not be further from the truth. I would say UT goes deep on the students. And so, if we look at the things that they're going to use to consider the student, they're going to look at the courses they took. which is gonna show up on their transcript. They're gonna look at the test scores. And even in academics, they're going to be looking to see what major is the student applying to, and does the coursework line up to that in some way? Then when we go to the student's resume, which is very, very important at UT Austin, and it's not really a resume like any of us would think of a resume. I would think of it more as a cataloging of the student's activities. So it might be 3 pages, 4 pages, 5 pages, long, because they really want a clear understanding of everything the student has done. I cannot stress how important that resume is in the process because that's where everything is cataloged. And then the essays feed into that, where the student has the opportunity to reflect on those activities that they've done around that major. Of course, major is going to play a part in the read because some majors, as Bob said, are more competitive than other majors. Demonstrated interest for UT, I think, is maybe useful on the margin, but not something that's really like a huge part of it. But the important thing is I could show you this same graphic for other colleges. It wouldn't be so heavily tilted towards major. So one of the things that I think is hard for families to orient to is that when you look at this graphic, this means you really need to plan backwards for this. Like you can't, if you try to be a great UT engineering candidate in your junior year, that's difficult, not impossible. We've had students do it, but it's difficult because all these things may not line up because you want them sort of pointing to engineering, everything pointing in that direction. So this is how a college would overall read, but the difference for UT is there's always that really large focus on major.
Two observations I would add to Lisa's point. One is that many of us, when we applied to college, were familiar with the term a well rounded student. Lisa, does the UT approach to fit to major align with the idea of a well rounded student?
Not so well, I would say. Now, there are ways to take things because students should be well-rounded. We don't want students to spend 4 years only doing things for their major. That's not healthy. And so I think it's got to be, you got to have enough activity, I would say 3 to 4 beats on your major. Then all that other wonderful stuff that a student's doing in leadership or on the sports team or on the dance team or in the band or whatever they community service, those things are wonderful because like UT does also love leadership, but that's not going to win by itself without of some fit to major beats. It's just not. So those things are great, and of course they're great in all college admissions, and they're healthy for students. But you're gonna still have to have that. You can't be the classic well-rounded, but I need to be able to read your transcript, read your resume, and read your essays and be really clear on where you're headed and what you want to do.
Which I think leads to the second point I would make, and that is there is actually nothing called being admitted to UT Austin. That actually doesn't exist. You are admitted to McCombs because you listed McCombs undeclared as your first choice major. You are listed admitted to the electrical engineering program, the Cockrell School of Engineering. You are admitted to your major, and your entire application is a case for that major. Now, good news. Increasingly, other colleges and universities in the United States have begun to follow some of this fit to major mindset. So, a student who focuses her efforts on a UT approach is really well positioned at a whole host of other competitive colleges and universities in the United States.
And we've really seen that with our students, I would say, is that we've seen that they oftentimes, if they're a strong UT candidate, they'll be strong all the way through because that preparation is a great for all colleges at this point. So let's talk a little bit about fit to major and a little more about what that is. That means, can I tell from you all of these materials what where you're headed, what major you really want? Now, one thing that is oftentimes surprising to people is that UT requires you to choose a first choice major. And historically, in all the students I've ever worked with, I've only had one student ever get their second choice major. And that was a student who was in the 6.5% when we were at the 6%. So, other than that, we have seen almost no student get anything but their first choice major. So if you think of this as like a dartboard, you are literally throwing that to one spot. And oftentimes students can be really like when they're filling out applications, be like, oh no, I think I changed my mind. I think I actually, this sounds really cool. I want to major in that. There is not a college in this country that you should not do that at more than UT. That has to be a planned out decision where you've really thought about how your application is going to align to that. So that first choice major decision is really critical. And going back to what Bob said about test scores, even at the test score, for example, if you're going for engineering, but you have a low math score, are you sure you want to go for engineering? Like that becomes an issue. So you really do have certain boxes that you need to be able to check to be competitive. And then the second choice major for our auto admit students, they get three options. So they do sometimes get their second or third choice major, but again, as Bob said, the majority of the students that we're working with are not in the top 5% or 6%. And so we're really looking at that one major. And so when we look at how UT looks at this, they're really evaluating all the preparation that the student has had. And they're considering all these things that we've already mentioned, the coursework, their grades, how much rigor did they take in those courses related to their major is also important. So when you're thinking about class choices, people often ask us like, should I take every single class AP? Well, that depends how strong a student you are, right? But one strategy might be to take really rigorous classes in those things that relate to your major if taking all AP classes would be too much. So that's how one has to kind of think about this so that one is putting together the fit to major profile. Bob, is there anything you would add there?
I think one of the things that we've certainly seen with students and families is that there are countless schools in the United States where great grades and great test scores are the primary consideration for admissions. Okay. It is fair to say historically that fit to major in the students that we work with, when we look at students we've worked with that have been admitted, they may have an extraordinary fit to major, an acceptable transcript, and a lower than average test score, and their fit to major still carries them into UT. And so I just think it's a consideration for families who have students who really want to go to the 40 acres to get your head around, because it isn't as if that is the last box to check. You can almost think of it
Exactly.
metaphorically as the first question to answer, and everything else hangs on that major choice. Lisa, is that something you've seen across the 2 decades of working with students, the sort of academic versus, like, we had a family the other day who said, my student had a straight A resume and a minus transcript, and they got in, and their best friend had an A plus transcript and a B resume, and they didn't get in. Is that consistent with the students you've worked with over 2 decades?
I think the act obviously there's a threshold that one has to have in grades, right? And test scores, and that's very dependent on what college you're applying into. But without the resume, we see students really struggling. Without the fit to major activities in that resume, we see students, struggle to get in. Bob, can you forward this slide? Thanks.
Yeah, this just gives you a recap of what we've talked about before. The competitive majors like Macombs, like Cockrell, like computer science. We would also note that there are many families who approach this by saying, well, my student's going to apply to economics and then transfer into business. My student's going to apply to physics and transfer into Cockrell. And the general guidance that UT has given increasingly over the last several years is that your best odds of getting into a competitive major is as an incoming freshman. The idea that you can sort of metaphorically bank shot yourself into a competitive major has not been our experience with hundreds of students. Your best shot is to apply as an incoming freshman. Now, at UT, there are a couple of ways that we encourage students who are trying to determine their major to approach that process. The great news about UT is that they provide a resource called Wayfinder. It's a research site that students can see different majors, career fields, the academic um, program for that school. And it really makes a big difference for the student as she's researching her major. We're big fans of students doing informational interviews with professionals who work in that space, who have achieved that major as an undergraduate, so that they can actually envision what the outcome of that major is, what the job that that student would have. Our guide to informational interviews includes a worksheet, it includes a template for the follow up email. We just think it's increasingly important for students to hear firsthand what that major prepares them for. Lisa, I know you've worked with tons of students who start their sophomore year or even their junior year still determining their major at UT. Are there any good practices that you've seen that can really help a student accelerate that discovery stage?
Well, I think the informational interviews, trying to see something sort of in the practical world is very, very helpful. And I think this is a place where parents can be super helpful. Normally, students aren't going to know someone who's an architect or whatever it is that they want to explore. But usually, parents will have someone in their network that they can find and connect their student with. And I think when the families and students that do this process, really, really love it. And it's so great for students just to hear from other adults on, their experiences in work and those kind of things because this is, while we're explaining this process, we also are very much understand teenagers. This is a lot to ask of teenagers to try to narrow this down as a sophomore or a junior in high school. So they need support. So I think giving a lot of our students will also do what's called shadowing, where they'll go for a day and just watch someone in a job. Kids love them. Like it's very rare that students, I mean, they sometimes have really funny stories after them, but like it like makes it real for them. So I think anything's, and if your student happens to be interested in what you're interested in, involve them a little bit in that. We have families that will let the student do like a practice project in the job that the parent has. So I think there's a lot of ways for parents to be really good facilitators in this process and help their students through something which is a little developmentally challenging for some students at this point.
One of the key decisions that we've seen students grapple with, and it oftentimes comes into focus in late sophomore year or early junior year, are they UT or bust or major focused? And it's a question, as an example, that a student who wants to be a marketing major at UT, but who bleeds burnt orange may then consider, should I consider communications, the Moody School, which is sensational and has many business focused majors, because I'm UT or bust? Or am I saying I will only attend a college where I'm admitted as a business student? The same with engineering versus some of their adjacent majors. And this is a key decision to make given the importance of fit to major in the evaluation of applicants. It's also a decision, frankly, that shouldn't wait until spring of junior year, because if you have a fit to major story that's hooked on one major and then you flip your major, your story and your major may totally miss one another. Lisa, do you and Delara want to talk a little bit about the role that essays play at UT?
Sure. So Delara is one of our wonderful coaches at College Match Point, but is also a phenomenal UT essay coach. So I can't pass by letting her answer a few questions here. So for UT right now, we have a personal statement, which you would have for every college in the country. And I think at UT that's marginally useful, but there's really one primary essay that is really pulling all of this together. So, Delara, can you talk a little bit about the major essay?
Yeah, of course. So the major essay is one of two short answer essays that UT applicants are required to write. It is a 300-word piece of writing, and the prompt is um, why are you interested in the major you indicated as your first choice major? This is a student's primary opportunity to make their case for their first choice major in their own words. It is where they can lay out their best examples of fit to major, what those activities have taught them about themselves, and their ability to succeed in their first choice major, while also showing that they understand what that major at UT can do for them. Part of what students are required to do in this essay is devote some time, usually a paragraph, to their interest in that major at UT. What particular programs in that major interest them? What professors do they hope to take classes with? What special opportunities are there that they can really see themselves taking advantage of, so that UT can really get a sense of how that student can fit into the school and is prepared to succeed within that major.
And Delara, should this be a real flowery story
Oh
kind of
gosh,
thing?
no. It's almost a metaphor we like to use with our students is that writing your major essay is almost like writing a legal briefing. It's very to the point, succinct. You only get 300 words, and I think, using any kind of creative flourishes is really going to be a waste of space here. As much as I love creativity in essays, the UT major essay is not the place for that. It's straightforward. It, has to cram in evidence of the student's fit to major. And so there really isn't room to tell stories or, be creative.
And I think that's a something that challenges some students. Like they want to do a whole paragraph on how their grandpa did what, and it's interesting. But you have to think of this as like real estate. This
Mhm.
is like precious real estate for what she's saying, which is you're making your case. And I really think if we think of the most important things other than your grades and your test scores, which aren't definitely important, the things that you can do to move the dial forward,
Yeah.
being first having that resume so you have something to reflect on and say here, and then second being able to make that case well and as efficiently as humanly possible so that you're fitting all the things that Delar just mentioned in it is so important. And this is where students who don't have those items really struggle, and I think don't have as much success in the UT process. Any other tips you have on that, Delara?
Do your research.
Yeah.
It's important to do your fit to major activities to really have an understanding of, what your interest in this major is. How did you get there? What do you like about the work that you might be doing in this major? But just as important is understanding what this major is going to be like at UT in particular. Something that's important to the university is understanding that students understand them. And so this is also your case to demonstrate your fit to major, but also your fit to UT's particular major.
Thanks, Delara.
Sure.
Appreciate that. Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to next talk about what is possibly the most distinctive aspect of the UT Austin admissions process, and that is the expanded resume. Lisa, do you want to talk about the expanded resume, its role in fit to major?
Sure. Absolutely. So the UT resume is not supposed to be go get a graphic designer and make the most beautiful resume ever. There's a pretty much of a standard format that they used to have on their website. I don't know that they have that document on there anymore. I looked for it the other day, but there's a standard process. And what we're really doing with each activity, the currency in college admissions on any activity is how many hours did you spend on it and how many weeks a year. That's the measuring stick, if you will. And what we're always doing on the UT resume is sticking that major, the things that the student has done related to the major, usually not coursework. If we have to put coursework, we're sort of scraping the barrel here. But experiences outside the classroom that the student has done, and we start with those. Then we typically show leadership next because those are the two things that UT is most focused on. And then we go all the way through all the students' activities. So this can be long. It also should be in student voice. I can't stress this enough. Oftentimes, parents want to go in and put it like we would have for a business document. UT loves heart, and that is something that they really like. So, like, it's when a student will put why they did it in as one of the bullets, it can really resonate and like tell another thing about the student. And this is a great place to slip in maybe some things that you didn't have time to get in that 350 words. So the resume, we start working with students on the resume like sophomore, junior year, and just start building that thing because we're also looking at, okay, wait, where do we have holes? What are we missing? It's like our document to catalog the whole thing. And I think that's one reason our students have been really successful as UT. This is not something we do in June of, when we're starting to apply. This thing is done by then. And then we're adding on for whatever the student did for the summer. But you should think of this as a critical piece of your application. Did you guys
Delora,
add
if a
anything to that? Did I miss anything?
I was going to ask Delora, if a student is applying to another school and they're going to communicate their extracurriculars on the Common App, which is the most frequent place to communicate the resume at most other schools, how much real estate do they have for their extracurriculars on the Common App?
So the Common Application allows 150 characters, including spaces. So really almost no space to communicate your investment in each activity. And you can only list 10 activities in the Common App. So the UT Expanded Resume is a chance to really show them what you got in as many words as it takes. It really is a benefit to students to put effort and time into it.
The other observation I would make based on our
Absolutely.
experience with students is that you can almost think of a schema or a structure here. At UT, that expanded resume and the major essay is the first place a human reader evaluates the student. It's not to say that the personal statement and the other short essay aren't important, but the first place they look to evaluate fit to major is the expanded resume and the essay on majors. Before we turn away from the expanded resume, Lisa, Delora, any last comments on do's and don'ts or expectations on the expanded resume?
I'd say
Make
start
it
early because I think you can see, yeah. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
as start early because it takes a lot of time to draft it and also to proofread it. And also make it legible and easy to read. It doesn't need to be, have any funky formatting. It doesn't need to include any colors or anything or pictures. Make it legible and get to work on it sooner rather than, the week you're turning in your application.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay.
Great. So we've talked a lot about the holistic review, the component pieces. At the core of our success working with students who are admitted to UT is activity planning, is the idea that you are going to become even more engaged as you progress through high school, that you're going to be able to build on your interests, take initiative, and ultimately have impact. Now, we always say to parents, there are some myths that we want to dispel. The first one is that extracurriculars and academics don't overlap, that they are really two components. That is not how teenagers behave. If they're interested in a topic in the classroom, that may be the starting point for them wanting to go deeper into that topic to more better understand its implications in the real life. The second thing is that we hear families say, well, I know my kid needs to join just a bunch of clubs. So they're going to go to the activity fair and they're going to join 600 clubs. And our answer is UT does not admit students by the poundage of their resume. They do not count up the 600 clubs they were a part of. And in fact, they want students to go deep. The third myth, and the one we wish we could dispel for everyone, is that students don't have to have one passion. I had a parent the other day say, my kid just doesn't have a hook. And if they don't have a hook, I know they're not getting in. And our answer was, you know what? Honestly, UT wants to see depth. They want to see interest. They want to see engagement. They don't expect a 17-year-old to have a passion. It's wonderful if they do. And then finally, UT is not a school that checks a resume and says, does this student have 160 hours of service hours? Now, we think volunteering is great. We think it's a core aspect of a student's values and oftentimes a family's involvement. But we want to dispel these four myths. Lisa, is there any context you would give around these four myths for parents to better understand?
I think probably the biggest one I hear is the hours, the community service hours thing. I think that that is like 5 years ago, 6 years ago. It really isn't. Now, if there's a student where community, like I have a client right now who loves community service, it's just a big part of who she is. So she has lots of hours, but those hours are focused on something she cares about. And really what this should be about when versus running up hours is what problems in the world is the student trying to address, and how have they done that? And that should be the definition of community service. Getting a bunch of hours because you cleaned up the dance and then you did this and then you did that is just not going to pop at UT or anywhere else for that matter. So I think that I do think showing that you care about other people and you care about the community is very important at UT and every college in this country right now. But I need to, as the reader, be able to understand what you care about or how you do that, how you engage, how you're a good community member. And number of hours isn't really what isn't how colleges are evaluating. So I would say to me right now, I think that's probably the biggest myth that continues to kind of go on, even though there's little to no evidence that that actually moves the dial.
College Matchpoint has a core model that we use because this idea of activity planning is just frankly so foreign to so many of us adults. It's just totally different from our high school experience. And so we'll send you a resume tomorrow in our follow-up note. You'll see it as an example. And most parents look at those resumes and think, what is this? I did nothing in high school like this. So we've developed a model, we call it I4, and that model says at the core of activity plan is the student. What are their aptitudes? What skills do they have? What motivates them? Interest is always something that comes out of those aptitudes, skills, motivations. Based on that, I'm interested in this and this and this. Over the high school years, most students take that interest, they get more involved in things. Many students, based on that involvement, step it up. They take initiative. And then there are students who really say, based on that initiative, I want to leave a lasting impact. I want to do a research project, build a curriculum, have an impact that is connected, but it starts with who I am. This model is not, what do I need to do to look good to UT? How do I pad my resume? Because the nice thing about UT is they can see a padded resume or a gamed resume from a mile away. It really starts with the student, and as Lisa said, starts with the heart, not simply a cold calculated do this, do this, do this. I joked with a parent the other day, it is not Google Maps. I cannot tell you, check this box, check this box, check this box, and your kid will show up at a dorm at UT. That is not the approach. There are some skills that UT increasingly thinks are critical to a student excelling on the 40 acres. Some of them are what you'd expect: character, the ability to listen, to communicate. A part that I think is surprising for some parents is that self advocacy is important. UT knows kids will struggle on campus in their freshman year. They're hoping it isn't the first time that a student struggled, and they're hoping that a student knows how to ask for help. Now, parents on this webinar who have ninth graders, our answer to families when they contact us in ninth grade and they say UT is on my radar screen, our answer is it's a marathon, not a sprint. You cannot look up at the end of your junior year and decide you want to be a computer science major at UT. You can't get there from here. The first priority for a ninth grader is to excel academically. The best thing you can do for your chances at UT is to be in the auto admit threshold. Hard stop. Once you've done that, once you have a great start to ninth grade, it's a great time to build on your interest, to get outside of your comfort zone, to expand your sights. I would say that more and more we do see ninth graders at the end of ninth grade either know what major they want or they're deciding among some majors that influences the ever important choice of what they're going to do in the summer between ninth and 10th grade. 10th grade, again, academics are the number one priority. A substantial portion of the students that we work with who are not auto admit and are admitted to UT know their major during 10th grade. And as a result, they've begun to take initiative. They've begun to step it up and they've begun to show leadership skills. And again, this is a myth that I think some folks carry into this. Well, my student isn't a quote unquote natural leader. She's not president of a club. He's not a founder of a club. UT knows that leadership comes in all flavors. That informal or interpersonal leader is every bit as important as a person who just made up a club so he could be president of it. And I would say we've never looked at it, but it's got to be close to 90% of the students we work with who are admitted to UT carve out time in the summer between 10th and 11th grade to do an activity that either confirms that major or builds on that initiative. Delara talked about the challenge sometimes of doing the essays. In a peculiar way, kids are drafting their essays in ninth, 10th, and 11th grade because they're doing the hard work that they're going to write about. Now, it's challenging to brainstorm and figure out how to fit that into 300 words, but it is really important to understand those are the activities they're going to write about. And those of you who have juniors who are on this call, again, junior year academics are the most rigorous year on most kids' transcripts. As Lisa said, carefully considering how many AP classes to take, how it matches to your major, crucial. In junior year, the majority of students that we work with who are applying to competitive majors are taking initiative. They've moved past having opportunities that are simply involvement, and they really are making a difference related to their major or in their community. Now, how is this fit to major communicated on the application? We've talked about the expanded resume, and we've talked about the essays. There are three other key components that we want to unpack a little bit to understand how this fit to major story all comes together. Lisa, in terms of activities, where do you see the greatest opportunity for parents to help in a student's activity plan?
Well, I think the first thing is to kind of know your student. So every student is going to go through this process differently. So you've got to start where they are. And I think sometimes I see parents wanting to, which is understandable. It's like anxiety. So you're like, they've got to get to here, but we have to start with the first step. And so for some students, it may be just help encouraging them to get involved in some activity. Then I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the ways we really see parents help is connect them to activities. If your student happens to be a student who is shy or not eager to do activities, in the younger years, could you do some things as a family? Could you do some community service as a family? Could you, visit, something of interest that might relate to their major as a family? So can you start out that way? And then something that I really encourage all families to do throughout high school, because this is ultimately what the college process is. The college application is a very large activity on reflection. And I think that unfortunately, because of the ways we students learn in school and just our society with social media, there isn't a lot of time that students are spending reflecting. So we notice over the years that students have had a harder and harder time in doing their applications because reflection isn't something, a muscle that they've used. So I would say one of the things is to um to weave that into your after dinner conversation, your dinner conversation, your car conversation, whatever. Start making reflecting on activity and experiences something that you're doing as a family on a regular basis. The other thing that I think as you enter this college process overall and UT, it's every week hear a parent tell me, well, we're just gonna put UT on there as a safety. And I'm like, oh, wow. Like, and that was a day when that was true. So I understand how people get at that. But the competitiveness of the environment of colleges right now requires parents, all of us who were, a little older, to remember that this process that your student is going to embark on applying to college is nothing like the process that we all went through. This is a totally different thing. And so it does sometimes for parents require some reorientation, if you will, because it's so vastly different. It's so much more competitive. And no place has that become more true than UT. I mean, I think it's just I often think like I'll read a student that doesn't get in and I'll think, oh, 3 years ago they definitely would have gotten in. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's just changed so rapidly and so fast. And it can feel personal because we all live in Austin and we relate to UT, and it's kind of the thing that the city is built around. And it's like, oh, my kid can go to UT. It's a fair amount of work to even be in the game, and that doesn't guarantee getting in. So what that means as a family is you want to give this your all. And I always say to parents, I'm not a fan of telling kids not to apply to UT because you never know if you're going to get into you apply. But also make sure that this college list has possible schools and match schools and schools that really honestly match your student. And because otherwise this process can be really, really hard. And be honest, if your student wants to be a major that they don't academically match to, don't do all the work for a UT application for something that the student doesn't have the test score for, doesn't have the academic background. Go back to Wayfinder and find some other majors if they're really UT or bust, because otherwise that throwing that one dart, we sort of know the outcome before the dart is thrown, and it's a lot of work for that. So I think for parents, it's helping students get engaged. And then as parents, which, Bob and I have been through, this with 2 kids, is we have to reorient expectations because this has changed. And I think you really do your student a favor when you do that, and help set them up for success.
One of the things that's critical at UT is the transcript. And sooner than you would imagine, parents, your child will be planning classes for next year, either ninth, 10th, or 11th grade. Lisa, any observations for families in terms of what we live in many of us live in Texas, so there's this real obsession on ranking and GPA, and then that's the end of the story. Really doesn't matter. All that matters is the two numbers, the ranking and the GPA. Is that true at UT, Lisa?
Well, I mean, GPA for the top 5% now, or top 6%, right, is really critical. But what I would say is, especially in the competitive majors, the level of rigor that a student has had is going to be really important. So, for example, many of these majors have what's called a calculus readiness. So the student either has to have successfully completed calculus, or be able to do a test to prove that they're calculus ready. So if your student is applying to one of these majors, but they're really not strong in math, then that's going to be a challenge. I think knowing that sooner rather than later. But within that transcript, especially in the more competitive majors, they're going to be looking for AP classes in math, in the sciences, depending on what the student is taking. And so, and this is really true now, is becoming true for many of our, not just UT, but especially at UT. So it's not just that number, which is what Bob is getting at. A lot of times students will tell me, well, I got a B, but it doesn't matter because it's an AP class. It actually does matter, because the average student in Texas has a 3.5 GPA. So A is sort of the most common letter on a transcript. So it actually, for most successful students, they're going to have mostly A's in rigorous coursework, especially if we're looking at these really competitive majors. And so understanding all that when you're choosing your classes really becomes important, because we've also got to balance that with, where's the student going to be successful, right? Like, we don't want to where a student is taking so many AP classes, but then they're not able to perform at a high level. So I would say class choice has become um more important as a piece of the college process, at the same time which schools don't have a lot of advising, public schools, in that. So I think that has become challenging for families.
We so appreciate you joining us this evening. This webinar is oh, hold on. We had a question come up, Lisa. Could you talk a little bit about why you think standardized testing has come back on the radar screen at UT, and the advice you would give to parents of sophomores and juniors as it relates to standardized testing?
Absolutely. So the good news is, we actually know why standardized testing came back at UT. President Hartzell has been pretty vocal about this. They did some following students who were test optional in the process, and they found that they had significantly lower GPAs and were struggling much more in college. So when they decided to go back to testing, it is because they're, of course, wanting to bring students to campus who can perform at a high level, right? And this is why I'm really going to be curious to see UT historically, even back before the pandemic, test scores weren't a huge part of their evaluation process. Now that he's like come out and said this publicly, that like that he feels that he could see who was performing by test scores, it's going to be interesting now to see how much do test scores play into this. I would say that students want to really in his UT has always focused their test score, the way they use test scores, on the major. So that's been consistent, and I think will be even more consistent now. And so making sure that whatever major you choose, that is relates with your strongest test score, I think is going to be very important as we go forward. And it's going to be something really interesting to follow. I'm going to be really glad when next year we can kind of open up the envelope and say, here's what happened. Because my hunch, having watched how this has gone, is that test scores will be a little more important than they were. Now, I think UT continues to be very holistic, but I do think they're going to be have an eye on, can students actually do the work at the level that they think their curriculum is at. Yeah.
The other thing that President Hartzell said was that, frankly, they got tired of expecting students to guess whether or not they should submit a test score. In our experience, test optional does not mean test ignorant. There are a handful of schools in the United States that are officially test blind. They cannot read test scores. But as the pandemic has shifted its phase, and as more and more students have access to a standardized test date, test scores are increasingly a critical input in the students that we see admitted to competitive schools. And so we encourage families, we talk with families we work with, have a standardized testing plan. Know which test best fits you. Many families consider how their student can most effectively prep for standardized tests. And don't put yourself in a situation where you're struggling in the middle of spring of junior year to get test dates and to get prep started. In terms of webinars, this webinar is one of a series. Most months, College Matchpoint does a webinar. On Monday, our colleagues are hosting a webinar. Guidewell is hosting a webinar with Rick Clark, who was the head of admissions at Georgia Tech and is generally considered to be one of the most respected leaders in terms of college admissions. And it will be provocatively entitled The Truth About College Admissions. I know I'll be there. We'll share the registration for that in the follow-up note. In January, we have our annual webinar on summer planning. I think we probably mentioned summer 10 times during the activity planning conversation. It is the time of the year where most kids finally have enough time to take initiative and to really have impact. It's so hard for these kids during the school year with their busy calendars and with how hard they're working in classes. In February, we have a webinar on college tours, how to make the most of them. And then in March, we have a webinar about the other highly selective schools other than UT and what college admissions trends look like at those schools. We've been so grateful for all the great questions that you ask. As I said, we'll be sharing in the follow-up note the recording of this webinar and the materials. And we wish you and your students great success. As much of a challenge as this might feel like on this webinar, kids get into UT. Non-auto admit kids get into UT. And it is a great university that motivates kids to do the hard work. And that hard work helps them at UT and frankly will help them at all the other schools they apply to. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of the evening, and we wish all of you success.